It began not with music, but with silence. The kind of silence that sits beneath gold ceilings and follows every footfall like a question. On the 15th of January, 1559, Elizabeth Tudor walked the long, pale ribbon of blue cloth stretching from Westminster Hall to the Abbey. Her steps were steady, too steady, as though rehearsed not for ceremony, but for survival. The people knelt and cheered, but behind their eyes was a memory they could not speak aloud. The child whose mother had died by axe now walked in white and crimson toward a crown. 3 separate crowns would be placed on her head that day. Not one was light. The archbishop's oil touched her shoulder blades, her palms, her breast, her scalp, and with each anointing, centuries of expectation, suspicion, and sacrilege pressed into her flesh. This was no ordinary coronation. It was an exorcism of doubt. A woman, illegitimate, imprisoned, nearly executed, now stood at the very center of the sacred order. To the crowd, Elizabeth was radiant. To the court, she was necessary, but to herself she was watchful. There are ceremonies that elevate, and then there are ceremonies that bind. This was both. She bore the ring placed upon her finger, not only as a symbol of England's mystical marriage to its monarch, but as a warning: love no man more than the land. Trust no man more than the law. The oath she swore was not to God alone, but to the ghosts of every queen who bled for a throne they could never keep. And Elizabeth had seen those ghosts. She had walked the tower where her mother had whispered her final prayers. She had lain awake in the same stone rooms, waiting to die. She had signed her name beneath desperate pleas and watched ink blur where her tears fell. Those who had come by river in chains often never left again, but she had. So when the crowd cried out, "God save the Queen," they did not know what they were cheering. They were not blessing a monarch, they were witnessing a resurrection. And Elizabeth, she did not weep. She did not smile. She held still, as though afraid the spell might break, as though the moment might vanish if she acknowledged it too warmly. Some women are crowned with flowers, some with ash. She wore both. The abbey bells rang out, but in her mind, another sound echoed louder, the sound of locks turning at the tower, the shuffle of guards at her cell, the voice of a dead queen in her blood. This was the beginning. But every step forward had been taken through shadows. Before she was crowned, before the abbey walls ever knew her name, she was nothing more than a political miscalculation wrapped in lace. Born on a September morning in 1533, Elizabeth was the daughter no one prayed for. Astrologers had promised a boy. Midwives prepared the nursery with blue linens and miniature swords. But the wail that rose from the birthing chamber belonged to a girl, and with it, the quiet unraveling of Anne Boleyn's fate had already begun. The christening proceeded anyway, brilliant and lavish. England still needed to believe. Braziers warmed the baptismal font. Trumpets echoed off the walls. Foreign ambassadors scribbled dutiful notes. But in the corners of the room, there was hesitation. The imperial ambassador refused to attend, calling Elizabeth a bastard and her mother a concubine. One cleric asked whether the infant had been baptized in hot or cold water, answered with a smirk, "Hot, but not hot enough." Anne Boleyn had been Henry VIII's second wife, his great gamble for a male heir. But after miscarriages and a stillborn son, the charm of her wit and clever tongue began to curdle in the king's eyes. When Henry turned his affections toward Jane Seymour, Anne's days were already numbered. The accusations came quickly: adultery, incest, treason, and her execution followed with terrifying swiftness. Tower Green, a French swordsman, one clean stroke. Elizabeth was just 3 years old. She never spoke publicly of that death, never mentioned the mother whose blood she carried. Some say she erased Anne from her memory, entirely a self-protective act of survival. Others believe she kept a portrait, hidden, tucked away in a book binding or between the pages of a Bible. What's certain is this in the void left by Anne's execution. Henry stepped in. To Elizabeth, he became not just father, but anchor, gravity, and God. But even Henry's favor was never certain. Parliament declared Anne's marriage null and void. Elizabeth, once a princess, was stripped of her legitimacy, her titles, and her future. She became Lady Elizabeth, the king's second bastard. From the ornate nursery she had once ruled as heir, she was cast into the periphery of the court, half forgotten, half feared. Her governor, Lady Bryan, wrote frantically to Cromwell the child had outgrown all her clothes. Did she still dine in her chambers, or was she old enough to eat at the high table? No one seemed to know where she belonged. Illegitimacy was not just a legal sentence. It was a social exile. At every step, Elizabeth was made to feel the echo of her mother's fall. Servants whispered when she passed. Courtiers gave curt nods. Foreign dignitaries referred to her with calculated disdain. But the most dangerous part of her childhood was not the shame, it was the uncertainty. She lived in a world where legitimacy could be rewritten with a signature, annulled with a whim, or extinguished with a blade. And yet, she endured. She studied. She read. She listened. The monks of Glastonbury Abbey, who once rang bells for kings and cared for the poor, were dragged from their homes and executed during Henry's religious revolution. Statues of the Virgin were smashed, candles extinguished, altars stripped bare. Even Elizabeth, barely old enough to ride alone, was swept into this tidal shift. The church that once would have anointed her with sacred oil now looked at her with suspicion. She was a child of schism, a product of defiance against Rome. Her very birth was theologically inconvenient, but exile sharpens, and Elizabeth sharpened with it. She grew into a girl who asked difficult questions, who sat straight-backed at her studies and learned the languages of both diplomacy and resistance. French, Latin, Italian. Greek not as curiosities, but as weapons. She translated Ovid and Cicero not to impress, but to prepare. Every sentence reversed into Latin again. Every nuance captured perfectly, as though the act of linguistic mastery could impose control on a world that had denied her order. Others might have broken under the weight of illegitimacy. She made it her forge. By the time Henry married his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, Elizabeth was reintroduced to court not as a favored daughter, but as a potential pawn. Henry, now bloated and ulcered, dying by inches, began to glance backward. In a rare gesture of reconciliation, he restored both Elizabeth and Mary to the line of succession in 1544. The act was more symbolic than sincere, a king hedging his bets against the fragile health of his only son, Edward. But for Elizabeth, it was a window, a glimmer of legitimacy, a foothold. She clung to it. At just 11, she prepared an extraordinary New Year's gift for her father, a trilingual manuscript, Latin, French, Italian, written in her own hand, bound in red cloth of gold. The calligraphy was flawless, the prose poised, the symbolism potent. On its cover, the initials of her father and stepmother were embroidered in fine thread, as if to say, I know the language of power. I know how to survive. No child writes with that kind of perfection unless she understands what's at stake. Elizabeth wasn't merely gifted. She was vigilant. She didn't ask to be born into this labyrinth of bloodlines and betrayals. But once inside it, she began to see its angles. Her life was not her own. It was a chessboard, and already she had learned how not to lose. There are men who enter a girl's life as guardians, and there are those who arrive cloaked in that word, but mean something else entirely. Elizabeth was 14 when Thomas Seymour began to visit her chambers in the early light, not as a steward of her safety, but as a thief of her confusion. She had already survived the treason of blood and parchment. Now, she would come to know the treason of touch. It began with laughter. He was her stepfather now, married to Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final queen, a woman Elizabeth admired and trusted. Seymour, 30 years her senior, was dashing and reckless. His ambition outpaced his rank, and where power did not yield to him, he pursued proximity to those who wore it. When the council forbade his marriage to Mary or Elizabeth, he pivoted swiftly to Catherine, whose mourning veil was still damp from Henry's tomb. Catherine relented. Elizabeth had no choice. The games began with childish gestures, a slash of her gown in the garden, tickling behind the bed curtains. Harmless. They called it innocent fun. But the boundary between innocence and violation is not always drawn in bruises. Sometimes it is felt in the breath that lingers too long, in the laughter that dies too fast, in the voice of a girl who doesn't know what to say. Elizabeth learned quickly not to say anything. At Sudley Castle, where she lived under their guardianship, Seymour had a key to her room. He would enter at dawn, sometimes half-dressed, sometimes fully silent, sometimes not. One morning, he slapped her backside as she scrambled to rise before he reached her bed. On another, he pressed himself against her and joked with the servants. When her governess, Cat Ashley, protested, he brushed her off with the casual cruelty of men who are never told no. But Catherine saw it. Eventually, even she educated, clever, royal, could no longer veil what was unfolding in her home. After one encounter, she caught them alone and said nothing, only stared. In her final months of pregnancy, her health collapsed not just from the strain of childbirth, but from the quiet rot of betrayal blooming beside her. She sent Elizabeth away. The farewell was formal, almost cold. They never saw each other again. Within weeks, Catherine was dead, buried at Sudley, and Seymour, unshackled, unchecked, turned his ambition toward Elizabeth once more. This time, it was no longer play. He proposed marriage openly, shamelessly. Cat Ashley strangely approved. She saw the union as a way to secure Elizabeth's future, to place her close to the heart of power. And Elizabeth, for a time, seemed tempted. She wrote back to Seymour, cautious but not dismissive. She was still a girl, but she was no longer naive. "I will not marry," she said, without the consent of the council. It was not love. It was a negotiation, one she never intended to complete. But Seymour had already drifted into madness. Failing in court, alienated from his brother, the Lord Protector of England, he resorted to farce and then to treason. One night, he entered the royal apartments with a sword in hand, perhaps to abduct the boy king, Edward VI, perhaps to make a final plea for influence. The plan unraveled quickly. A dog barked. He stabbed it. Guards arrived. He was arrested, charged, and condemned. And now the shadows turned toward Elizabeth. She was summoned, interrogated, questioned for days. Her servants were taken. Cat Ashley was imprisoned in the Tower, under threat of torture. Cat confessed every scandal, the garden romps, the ripped gowns, the early morning visits. Each detail was transcribed, word for word, into the state record. But Elizabeth refused to collapse. She said nothing, admitted nothing, showed no tears. A rumor spread that she was pregnant, that Seymour had compromised the king's sister, that she was not merely a bystander, but a conspirator. Elizabeth replied only with contempt. "These are shameful slanders." When Somerset, the Lord Protector, declared her guilty in his heart, she answered, "Then your heart is without proof." The girl who once translated Cicero now wielded his logic as a shield. She would not yield. Seymour was executed on Tower Hill in March 1549. Elizabeth did not weep. She did not write. But something in her calcified that day, a final hardening of the girl who once played hide-and-seek behind velvet curtains. The world of men guardians, suitors, traitors had shown its face, and she would never again allow herself to be caught beneath it. From that point forward, she wore caution like armor. She studied harder, rode horses faster, kept her thoughts cloistered behind a smile that revealed nothing. The headaches returned pulsing. Invisible illness brought on by stress, but she never paused her education. She refused marriage proposals, as one might refuse poison politely served. Her favorite reading now included treatises on virginity, asceticism, and moral discipline, when others adorned themselves in finery. She appeared barefaced, hair uncurled, dressed plainly, a Protestant Joan of Arc, if not in armor, then in intent, even at court. She played the part of chastity, not because she lacked desire, but because she knew desire was currency, and currency must be hoarded. The Seymour scandal had taught her the lesson her tutors never could, that in England, a woman's body was a battlefield, that proximity to power did not protect it, invited peril, that virginity, paradoxically, could become the most potent weapon of all. She chose solitude, not as retreat, but as strategy. And in that solitude, a queen began to sharpen her mind like a blade. She had been a pawn, a scandal, a suspect, but not a fool and not a victim. The world would not touch her again. It was winter when the summons came. Cold seeped into the mortar of Hatfield House. Cold, too, crept into her bones, but not from weather. It was political, ceremonial, deliberate. Elizabeth had been called to court, but she was not being honored. She was being contained. Mary Tudor, now Queen of England, had taken the throne with the roars of the people and the blessing of Rome. Her reign had begun with prayers and processions, but beneath the incense and Latin murmurs, there was suspicion, and Elizabeth was its axis. She was Protestant, popular, and dangerously patient. A Tudor by blood, but not by belief. At first, Elizabeth complied with caution. She attended court, smiled through clenched teeth, nodded at the mass, but in private, she remained as unreadable as vellum before ink. Mary pressed harder. Elizabeth delayed. A sudden illness spared her from the nativity mass. A diplomatic stomachache ruined the solemnity of a feast. These were not lies. They were acts of self-defense. Mary wasn't fooled, and when rebellion stirred, Elizabeth's name surfaced like a bruise. It was Sir Thomas Wyatt who lit the fire, a nobleman furious over Mary's betrothal to Philip of Spain. Foreign marriage, foreign power, foreign faith. To many Englishmen, it was betrayal. Wyatt gathered men and marched on London. Elizabeth, too, received word of the rebellion. But she did not answer in writing. She answered with silence. It was not enough. Wyatt failed. His army scattered. His blood darkened the scaffold at Tower Hill, and Elizabeth, though never openly aligned with him, was summoned again, this time under suspicion of treason. The arrest was not announced with chains, but with protocol. Courtiers arrived, servants packed, guards stood by the gates. When Elizabeth heard she was to be taken to the Tower, she wrote. The letter was long, too long. She stretched her plea across the parchment with measured dignity. But as the sentences ran on, so did her desperation. The lines began confidently crisp penmanship, clean ink, but by the second page, tremors leaked into the script. Errors crept in. She corrected them. She ran out of words before she ran out of space, so she filled the margins with diagonal strokes, drawing great lines across the parchment, a primitive form of encryption, ensuring no additions could be made after she signed it. At the bottom, just above her signature, she wrote, "I humbly crave but one word with yourself." Mary never replied. The next morning, Rain misted over the Thames. Elizabeth boarded the boat in silence, hands hidden in her sleeves. The river was high, the tide uncertain. When she stepped onto the Tower wharf, her feet slipped slightly, the first and only betrayal of her composure at the water stairs. She turned to the crowd guards, servants, a few courtiers, and spoke not as a girl, but as a monarch already. "I beseech you all, my friends and fellows, bear witness that I come here no traitor, but as true a subject to Her Majesty as any now living." She was 20. The gates closed behind her with the groan of centuries. She was led through shadowed corridors to the bell tower, the very place where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had once waited for execution. Now the daughter waited, and she remembered. The weeks passed like smoke. Rumors circulated that she would be tried, that she would be burned, that Mary's womb was swelling, that Philip of Spain demanded her head. Elizabeth grew ill, not theatrically, not manipulatively, but deeply. The headaches returned. Her appetite vanished. She wandered her cell, sleepless, staring at the walls where so many had prayed before dying. One morning, she heard footsteps. She braced herself. Sir Henry Bedingfield stood at the door. He had not come to kill her. He had come to move her. Elizabeth was to be removed from the Tower and sent to Woodstock, a manor outside Oxford, grand and isolated. But this was not freedom. Bedingfield was her jailer, and she knew it. His every gesture was precise, lawful, suffocating. He kept the garden gates locked. He screened every message. When she asked for ink and paper, he hesitated. When she asked for solitude, he refused. She began calling him Cerberus, the hound at Hell's Gate, but she did not sleep. She did not weep. She waited. Mary, meanwhile, believed herself pregnant. The court prepared for a royal christening. Elizabeth was summoned, commanded to play the part of the dutiful sister at the baptism. She complied. It was a phantom pregnancy. No child came. No future queen was born. Instead, fires were lit. Mary's religious reign sharpened into something darker. The first Protestants were burned in Smithfield, then more, hundreds. The air above English cities began to smell of char and human fat. Some were tied with gunpowder bags to hasten their end. Most were not. They screamed. They prayed. They died. Elizabeth watched. She said nothing. But she changed. Her black dresses became plainer still. She refused jewels, refused lovers, refused alliances. Her very appearance became a statement that she would not tempt, not indulge, not bend. Her body became her politics, her silence, her sword. And yet the pressure to marry returned. Philip of Spain, now wed to Mary, considered Elizabeth a secondary tool. Perhaps she could marry his cousin or another Catholic prince. She refused, courteously, firmly. Her body would not be used, not again. By 1558, Mary was dying. She had no heir, no hope, just fevered prayers and fading light. The council urged her to name Elizabeth as successor. At first, she resisted. Then, 10 days before her death, she relented. On November 17th, as the bells tolled and London stirred beneath a grey sky, Elizabeth was walking in the gardens of Hatfield. Messengers approached, fell to their knees, and addressed her as queen. She sank to the ground and whispered from Psalm 118, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." But her eyes were dry. She had not won. She had survived. It was not the throne that made her a queen. It was what she endured to reach it. From the moment she was proclaimed sovereign, Elizabeth understood that every gesture now carried the weight of spectacle and symbol. Power in England had always been a performance, but for a woman, it had to be a miracle. On November 23, 1558, she rode through the gates of London not in armor, but veiled in calculated majesty. Behind her trailed a train of over 1,000 nobles, attendants, and courtiers. Before her, waves of cheers rose like cathedral bells. The people had seen queens before queens consort, queens regent, queens disposed, but never one who had stepped from a prison cell to the throne by force of sheer endurance. She was not Mary. She was not Anne. She was something new, something England had not yet learned how to name. Elizabeth consulted Dr. John Dee, court astrologer and mystic, to divine the most auspicious date for her coronation. The answer was clear. January 15th, the dead of winter, the edge of survival. The stars did not tremble, they aligned. The ceremony unfolded like a sacred play, from Westminster Hall to the Abbey. A long swath of blue cloth was laid upon the streets not for comfort, but for consecration. Crowds pressed forward to snatch pieces of it as souvenirs. These were not simply loyal subjects. They were witnesses to an apparition, a woman rising where ruin was expected. Inside the Abbey, the ritual was dense with mystery. 3 crowns were placed upon her head, each heavier than the last, each a relic of monarchs who had ruled and fallen. Bishop Oglethorpe anointed her with holy oil on the traditional 7 points head, breast, shoulders, palms. It was not just an act of blessing, it was transubstantiation. Elizabeth was becoming sovereign not by lineage alone, but by sacrament. On her finger, they slid a ring, the emblem of her mystical marriage to the realm. It gleamed like any wedding band, but it bore no man's name. The union it symbolized would be lifelong and unbreakable. In the eyes of God and the state, she now belonged to England. And England, if it dared, belonged to her. She played the role to perfection, every movement choreographed, every word uttered with the cadence of myth. She was humility and authority, virgin and victor. When she emerged from the Abbey, the air rippled with something more than triumph. It was relief. The people had feared a second Mary. Instead, they saw a woman who bore the weight of death and chose life. But Elizabeth knew better than to confuse celebration with security. She returned to Whitehall, not to revel, but to reckon. Her council was fractured. Her kingdom was exhausted. The realm bled from religious division, economic decay, foreign humiliation. And yet, above all this, loomed 2 ominous convictions shared by almost every advisor and ambassador who had watched her ascend, that no monarch could rival the legacy of her father, and no woman could rule alone. She did not dispute them. She simply disproved them. Her first act of authority was not to declare war or seek a husband. It was to choose her voice. She selected William Cecil, a man of quiet intellect and Protestant caution, as her chief secretary. In him, she saw a mind like her own, analytical, restrained, but deeply loyal. She told him, "I mean to have but one mistress here and no master." And with that, she began. In the months that followed, Elizabeth presided over the cautious dismantling of Mary's Catholic legacy. The crosses came down. The Latin prayers grew faint. The fires were doused. But she moved slowly, not out of fear, but precision. Unlike her sister, she would not rule by terror or zealotry. Her authority would be rooted in performance and patience. When foreign envoys pressed her to marry, she smiled. When nobles conspired, she listened. When sermons denounced female rule, she read them and rewrote the ending. The crown was no longer her ambition. It was her shield. She understood, in ways no man could, that her body was now political terrain. Every potential husband was a threat to sovereignty. Every alliance, a compromise. So she did what no other queen had done. She remained alone, but never isolated. She kept courtiers close, but never too close. She danced, but never faltered. She flirted, but never fell. Her chastity became a myth, her silence a weapon. And as the years unfolded, so too did a new image of monarchy, one forged not in the fires of masculine conquest, but in the quiet, strategic elegance of survival. In public, she was glorious. In private, she remained watchful. The same girl who once drew inked lines across a desperate letter, who waited for death beneath the tower, who slipped on the rain-slick steps of fate, that girl never vanished. She simply stood taller, louder, more luminous, but always with one eye on the blade. Because Elizabeth Tudor had not inherited her crown. She had earned it by bleeding without bleeding, by burning without ash, by enduring without breaking. And in doing so, she became not just Queen of England, but master of its myth.